Questions orales, oral questions. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, CSIS warned the Liberal government all the way back in 2015 that returning ISIS fighters were a continuing and real threat to Canada. They warned that Canadian citizens were recruited by ISIS, quote, not because they needed more foot soldiers, but because they want to teach the Westerners to take the struggle into every neighborhood and subway back home. So ISIS specifically trained Canadian fighters to come back here and terrorize our community, and the Liberals knew about it for over 2 years. So why is the Prime Minister so focused on reintegration services and not putting these people in jail?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this government, like all governments, takes extremely seriously the safety of Canadians, and that's why everything we do is focused on keeping Canadians safe. And we know that a society that is safe is one in which we are using a broad range of tools to keep Canadians safe. Yes, we have enforcement, surveillance, and national security tools that we use to a significant degree, but we also have methods of de-emphasizing or de-programming people who want to harm our society, and that's the things we have to move.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Order.
Mr. Speaker, it's this Prime Minister that's de-emphasizing Canadian security, and Canadians are tired of it. It was Conservatives who amended the criminal code to make it an offence to leave Canada to fight for ISIS. It was Conservatives who were focused on giving our law enforcement new tools to prosecute ISIS fighters. This Prime Minister is using a broad spectrum that includes poetry and podcasts and all kinds of counselling and group hug sessions, Mr. Speaker. When will the Prime Minister take the security of Canadians seriously and look for ways to put these ISIS fighters in jail?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Party learnt nothing from the last election and the lessons Canadians taught them. They ran an election on snitch lines against Muslims. They ran an election on Islamophobia and division. And still, they play the same games trying to scare Canadians. The fact is, we always focus on the security of Canadians, and we always will. And they play politics of fear, and Canadians reject that.
Wednesday come early. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Order. Order.
Mr. Speaker, nobody voted in the last election to elect a government that would be so focused on the rights of ISIS terrorists, people who watch soldiers burned alive in When people like that come home, they don't need to spend time writing haikus. They need to spend time in jail. When will the Prime Minister take that seriously?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister. Order.
Mr. Speaker.
Order. The Honourable Member for St. Albert, Edmonton, and others on his side will come to order. Order. When it comes to the same level or anywhere near it, I'll say so. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition, the Prime Minister.
Speaker, we can see that Stephen Harper's Conservative Party is alive and well. They are doubling down on the same approaches they had in the last election, the same approaches that Canadians rejected. I wish them luck.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, given the cloud of ethical scandals that seem to grow worse every day, a simple question for the Prime Minister: does he still have confidence in his finance minister?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the finance minister lowered taxes for the middle class and raised them on the wealthiest 1%. He delivered on a Canada Child benefit that is helping 9 out of 10 Canadian families and reducing child poverty by 40%. He strengthened the CPP for a generation with a historic agreement with provinces. He's lowered small business taxes to 9%. He continues to focus on the things that matter to Canadians, and he has our full confidence.
The
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
So, Mr. Speaker, fined by the Ethics Commissioner for hiding offshore corporations. Under investigation by the Ethics Commissioner for introducing pension legislation that benefited himself and his family, misleading Canadians as to whether or not he actually divested himself of the shares that he owns. And now questions being raised about the sale of $10 million worth of Morneau Chappelle shares just days before he introduced tax measures that would drastically affect the market. So one quick question for the Prime Minister. Can we expect his Finance Minister to deliver the next budget?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, there's a lot of people in this House who are watching Question Period perhaps for the first time across the country. The fact is, it is an opportunity to talk about substantive issues of the time that affect Canadians in terms of policy. The members opposite choose to go with personal attacks. A handy way of evaluating whether those personal attacks are baseless or groundless is whether or not the members opposite are willing to repeat them outside of this House where there is no parliamentary privilege. But Mr. Harper, Mr. President, what we see is that this is Stephen Harper's party through and through.
L'honorable député de Rimouski-Nejet-Témiscouata-les-Basques.
The Honourable Member for Rimouski-Nejet-Témiscouata-les-Basques. The NDP has called on the Ethics Commissioner to launch another investigation on the Minister of Finance and the suspicious sale of shares in Morneau Chappelle in 2015. If the Commissioner decides to open an investigation, this will be the fourth on the current government, including 2 on the Minister of Finance and 1 on the Prime Minister. In his mandate letter to the Minister of Finance, the Prime Minister demanded of him, and I quote, "The arrangement of your private affairs should bear the closest public scrutiny." When will the Prime Minister enforce the rules that he established himself?
Please.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I feel bad for members of the opposition because what they're doing, or in fact what we're doing, is delivering for the economy. We're delivering benefits for Canadian families. They're making a huge difference. We have a national housing strategy that was applauded across the country. We aren't giving them much room for criticism, and they must move on to personal attacks, which is unfortunate for our democracy, for our government, and for the country. The Honourable Member for Rimouski-Nejet-Témiscouata-les-Basques. Mr. Speaker, I find it odd that the Minister is citing his mandate letter and calling it a personal attack. And if we listen to what he said when he was in opposition, he said back in 2013 that Canadians deserve to have leaders who tell them the truth. Leaders take up their responsibilities not only when things go well, but also when they don't. So why is the Prime Minister of 2017 not listening to the member for Papineau for 2013? And why is he not undertaking his responsibility to tell Canadians the truth? The Right Honourable the Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, our government has shown a level of transparency and openness and accountability that was unknown in the past. We will continue to work with the Ethics Commissioner. We will continue to answer questions. We will continue to show that we are working hard every day to warrant the trust Canadians have placed in us.
The man who's under investigation by the Ethics Commissioner. The definition of insider trading is, quote, the use of undisclosed material information for profit. Here are the facts. The Finance Minister told the National Post he sold $10 million in Morneau Chappelle shares in December 2015. 6 days later, he introduced a tax change that would have lost someone selling $10 million in shares $500,000. And just minutes ago, the Finance Minister refused to tell reporters if it was he who, in fact, had sold those shares. Given all of this, how can the Prime Minister still have confidence in his Finance Minister?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I don't exactly blame the NDP for not remembering the 2015 election. It was a pretty bad one for them. But we were very clear throughout the entire campaign that we were going to lower taxes for the middle class and raise them on the wealthiest 1%, and that exactly is what we did. They have some theory about undisclosed that simply doesn't apply. We have anchored ourselves in telling people what we were going to do and doing it. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? It's working. We have the strongest growth in the G7 because of our Finance Minister, because of the plan.
The honourable member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Telling people what you're going to do and actually doing it. You know what's ironic about all of this? That if the finance minister had actually done what he told people he was going to do and put his things in a blind trust, none of this would be an issue. The PM's instructions for the finance minister was, and I quote, he must avoid conflict of interest, the appearance of conflict of interest, and must avoid situations that have the potential of conflict of interest. The finance minister has failed to live up to that standard, and because this prime minister has failed to enforce the standard, we've had to once again write the ethics commissioner. So if all of this isn't a conflict of interest to this prime minister, what exactly is?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this minister, like all members of this House, worked with the Ethics Commissioner exactly to avoid any conflicts like this. The Ethics Commissioner exists above the back and forth of Parliament to ensure that people are following the rules and that mistakes are not made. That is exactly the job that she has been fulfilling, and that is exactly where Canadians can be reassured that despite the personal attacks of the members opposite, the Ethics Commissioner is being followed.
The honourable member for Richmond Arthabaska. Mr. Speaker, here are the facts. December 2015, the Minister of Finance is the owner of thousands of Morneau Chappelle shares. The 30th of November, someone sells 680,000 shares worth $10 million. Shortly thereafter, the minister introduces tax measures that caused a 5% drop in the value of those shares. And that enabled the person to avoid losing $500,000. Given the Minister of Finance still had a say in his company in 2015, can he tell us who sold those shares? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've mentioned several times for the benefit of the member opposite, the Minister of Finance has always worked with the Ethics Commissioner and followed up on recommendations. Now, if you want some facts, they had the worst growth in GDP since Mackenzie King and the second worst growth rate since the Second World War. We've got 3.7% growth over the past year, the best in the G7. 500,000 jobs have been created, 40% reduction in poverty. That is the work of this government, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member for Richmond Arthabaska. Mr. Speaker, what we want, what Canadians want, are simple answers to simple questions. If the minister has nothing to hide, he should just answer the questions. A couple of weeks before tabling tax measures that would affect his own company, someone sold 680,000 in Morneau Chappelle shares, and that enabled them to avoid losing $500,000. So, since he was still in the company, can he tell us who sold those 680,000 shares in Morneau Chappelle? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, I think that for the benefit of my colleague opposite, that the measure that he's talking about is a 1% tax on the wealthiest Canadians and a tax drop for middle-class Canadians. It was a commitment that we made during the campaign. Those are our commitments, and we are sticking to them. Those commitments have given Canadians the money they need in their pockets. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Carlton.
Mr. Speaker, the member says that the tax change was a promise. So was electoral reform. So was the $10 billion deficit that suddenly became $20 billion. So was a tax on stock options that never happened. Promises mean nothing. Motions in the House of Commons move markets. And only that minister knew when he would introduce that motion and was able to predict what impact it would have on stock markets. Someone sold 680,000 shares prior to the introduction of that motion, saving $500,000. Who was it?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've said on several occasions, the Minister of Finance has followed and complied with the request of the Commissioner. The Commissioner of Ethics is taking action, and we have confidence in her integrity.
Well, Mr. Speaker, yesterday, John Iveson indicated that he had seen some documents showing that the sale of the 680,000 shares by the minister would have happened on December the 3rd. December the 3rd would be the settlement date for a sale that would have happened on November the 30th. We know that such a sale occurred by somebody, and that somebody avoided a 5% drop in Morneau Shepell shares that happened after he introduced his motion. Can the minister confirm that he was the one that sold that block of stock?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the Minister of Finance took on his role, he has complied with the Commissioner, and we are put in place a screen. And all assets were held in that way. He will continue the important work he is doing.
Back to everything was done with the Ethics Commissioner. I wonder if the minister told the Ethics Commissioner that he was going to sell $10 million of shares in stocks that would drop only a week later when he introduced a bill affecting the entire stock market. So I'll ask that question directly. Did the minister discuss the date of the sale of the shares along with the date of his motion on taxes?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having had an opportunity last night to conduct a panel with the member opposite, I saw his caution not to repeat outside of this House the remarks that he is making here. He can simply make them outside should he so desire. What I can say is that the tax measures that he is referring to are tax measures that saw an increase in taxes for on the wealthiest 1% and a decrease for other Canadians. These are commitments we made in the campaign.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the member is absolutely right. We did do a panel yesterday, at which point I asked outside of the walls of this House when the Minister of Finance sold his 680,000 shares in Morneau Shepell. I also enumerated all the facts leading up to that sale. And I am absolutely confident that everything I've said out there and in here is true. Would he commit that if I go out and repeat my question in the lobby at this moment, that the Finance Minister will meet me there and answer the question?
Order. I ask members not to bang on their tables. Applause is permitted. Not banging on their desks. Members should know that on all sides.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Order, please. Mr. Speaker, I think that the member didn't understand my answer, so perhaps I can reiterate it for him. I asked him was he prepared to repeat the allegations, not the questions. There's a very big difference. Now, Mr. Speaker, what I can tell you is that the Minister of Finance has always worked.
Mr. Island Powell, est-ce que le secrétaire parlementaire a fini? Okay. The honourable member for North Island.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday we learned that more than 30 local and community newspapers across the country will be shut down. The Heritage Minister has been talking the talk, but the news industry about the news industry crisis. She had options yet did nothing to prevent this disaster. Now she's saying she will study the issue, but with no action, frankly, there won't be much left to study. How can she sit back and do nothing as nearly 300 people lose their jobs? What will the minister say to her colleague for Orleans and his constituents when Orleans News shuts down?
Honourable Minister of Canadian Heritage.
Like my colleague, I'm disappointed to see that Postmedia and Torstar decided to close these local media a month before Christmas, and actually all my thoughts are with the workers and their families. These are cynical business decisions that were taken by Postmedia and Torstar, and it's up to these companies to explain them. As for local news, Canadians value them, and of course, as a government, we'll continue to provide our support to the local media. Thank you.
The honourable member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert. If I were the member for Orleans, I wouldn't be very reassured by that. If we needed another signal to sound the alarm on media, well, we heard it with the announced closure of some 30 local newspapers and the loss of 300 jobs. She doesn't look surprised. Well, we've been talking about this for years, in fact. There have been many reports, and we put forth some tangible turnkey solutions for the minister. But no, the ship is sinking. The Liberal orchestra continues to play as if nothing were happening. Seems to me I saw that in a movie somewhere. Will the minister at some point adopt measures for the industry, or will she simply wait until we have no newspapers left before she wakes up? The Honourable Minister. I'm shocked, as my colleague is, to see that Postmedia and Torstar made those decisions just a month before the holiday season. My thoughts are with the workers and their families. These are cynical corporate decisions by Torstar and Postmedia, and it's up to those companies to explain them. Of course, on the government side, we will continue to support local media. 75 million per year is what we are investing, and we'll continue. The honourable member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert, I would urge him not to interrupt the minister while she is speaking. The honourable member for Louis Saint-Laurent. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, earlier during question period, the Prime Minister said that his government was transparent, accountable, and worthy of confidence. Those are his exact words. So here's a good opportunity for the government to show that, because what we know is that on December 7th, the minister brought forth tax measures that had a direct impact on the stock market. There was a 5% loss in shares at his own company, Morneau Chapelle, but a few days earlier, November 30th, someone sold 680,000 shares and saved $500,000. Now, in order to be accountable, to show confidence and transparency, can the Minister of Finance tell us if, in fact, the Minister of Finance is the one who sold those shares? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance has always worked with the Commissioner to preserve the integrity of this Parliament. He is following her advice and will continue to do so. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint-Laurent. Mr. Speaker, all Canadians know that ministers sometimes forget things. Over 2 years, he forgot that he owned a villa in Provence. Now he seems to have forgotten who sold 680,000 shares worth $10 million in his own company. The Parliamentary Secretary said earlier, Mr. Speaker, and I quote, he sold all of his shares in reference to the Minister of Finance. Can the Parliamentary Secretary when, in fact, the Minister sold all of those shares? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned several times in the past, all members, all ministers work with the Ethics Commissioner to ensure that the rules guiding us are followed. That is precisely what the Minister of Finance did when he took up his role here. The Minister placed his shares in a trust. He has donated to charity. And thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Opposition House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the Finance Minister has been pretty busy lately with sorting out his ethical lapses, with raising taxes on Canadians while sheltering his own from taxes. He's had his mind pretty preoccupied, and so maybe that's why yesterday he couldn't quite remember what he did in November 2015. But 24 hours has passed, and I'm hoping the Prime Minister may have spoken with his Finance Minister. Can the Prime Minister tell us if the Finance Minister sold 680,000 shares in Morneau Chapelle in November 2015? Yes or no?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. The Minister of Finance, as I've already mentioned, has worked with the Commissioner since the start of his mandate, as she is in charge. Far be it from the partisanship in this House to do that. Integrity is being respected. The Minister of Finance has always worked with the Commissioner and will continue to do so.
House Leader.
In November 2015, someone sold a whole lot of Morneau Chapelle shares and in the process saved a whole lot of money. Now, either the Finance Minister, one, doesn't know who sold them, two, knows who sold them and it wasn't him, or knows who sold them and it was him. It's one of three answers, very simple. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? No more threats from the Liberals. I don't think they're in any position to threaten us. Just answer the question.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, as the member knows, The Commissioner is responsible for integrity and standards, and it's with the Commissioner that the Minister of Finance has always worked fully transparently to ensure that the rules are respected and complied with. That is what is expected of all members, all ministers, and that's what the Minister of Finance has done.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, there were over 60 opioid overdoses in Montreal, and the crisis has reached Laval this fall, where 10 overdoses have occurred. The problem is only getting worse all over Canada. It's been a year since the NDP asked the Liberal government to deal with the opioid crisis as a national emergency, to give more resources to communities that need them. While 7 people are dying every day, what is this government waiting for to declare that the opioid crisis has become a national emergency? Honourable Minister of Health. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government is deeply concerned by the situation of the opioid crisis in Canada. Emergency interventions are taking place. Federal investments are being made, and they are significant. In the future, we are going to work with provinces and territories to increase access to treatment. These innovative responses are responding to the crisis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, devastating news out of Alberta reveals a 40% increase in opioid deaths this year, and Canada will lose 3,000 lives in 2017. Families affected by this crisis are growing dismayed by the Prime Minister's glacial response. In fact, Mums Stop the Harm has started the Do Something Prime Minister campaign by sending photos of lost loved ones to the PMO. Now, the Prime Minister has ignored our calls to declare the opioid crisis a national public health emergency. How many more Canadians need to die before he finally listens?
Here. The Minister of Health.
Impact of the opioid crisis that has faced our country, and we remain committed to taking action through this compassionate, collaborative, and evidence-based approach. And I also had the opportunity to meet that group when I was in Vancouver or Edmonton last week. Formal declarations of an emergency will not provide us with any additional tools or extra measures to provide to the opioid crisis. Our government will continue to work with all partners to address this crisis and the underlying cause of problematic substance use. Thank you.
Member for Oakville North Burlington.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives have tried to score political points with their so-called support for free speech at post-secondary institutions. Yet there hasn't been a word from the Leader of the Opposition after a group was prevented last week from showing a pro-choice documentary on a university campus. It seems like he's only in favour of free speech when it's an opinion he agrees with. Can the Minister of Science please tell this House what our government's position is on this important issue?
The Honourable Minister of Science.
Thank you to my colleague for Oakville North Burlington for her question.
Committed to creating open spaces for Canadians to debate and express their views. We also firmly support a woman's right to choose. In a free society, we may disagree with the person's views, but we must defend their right to have them and hold them unless those views promote hate. The opposition's leader's silence suggests he will only stand up for free speech if it's politically convenient. You can't cherry pick on free speech.
Members could all show a little respect for free speech by not interrupting when someone else has the floor. The Honourable Member, l'Honorable Député de Beauce.
The Honourable Member for Beauce. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Morneau's office confirmed to the National Post that someone sold over 680,000 shares. It is forbidden to mention the names of members. He may continue without doing so. The office of the minister told the National Post that someone sold 680,000 shares from Morne Chapelle in November of 2015. $15 a share, which allowed that person to save $500,000. My question is simple. Is that person the Minister of Finance? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance has always worked with the Ethics Commissioner and mentioned that he has always worked in full transparency with her, revealing the full extent of his assets, and has respected the highest standards of integrity. He will always work with the Ethics Commissioner. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Beauce. My colleague says that the minister is working with the Ethics Commissioner. If that's true, did he ask for authorization from the Commissioner before making that sale of 680,000 shares from his own family's business, which allowed him to make a profit of $500,000? Shares went down by 75 cents a share afterwards. Did the minister inform the Ethics Commissioner of his intention to sell the shares of his company in November 2015, yes or no? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Finance has always worked transparently with the Ethics Commissioner and followed her recommendations. He put up a conflict of interest screen, which she considered to be the best measure. He went even further, as the member for Beauce knows, by divesting himself of the rest of his shares and putting all his holdings in a blind trust. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I tried asking the minister if he sold 680,000 shares on November 30th inside the House of Commons, and now I invited him to come and answer that question outside of the House of Commons, and I know the House will be disappointed to learn that he did not show up to answer the question. So, will the Prime Minister answer it on his behalf? Who was it that sold 680,000 Morneau Chappelle shares 1 week before tax measures were introduced on Florida?
Secretary Parlementaire.
Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned, the Minister of Finance has always worked with the Ethics Commissioner and will continue to do so. I'm happy to see him talk about tax measures announced in December 2015 that respects a commitment that we took, which is to increase taxes for the 1% wealthiest. The opposition is concentrated on giving tax breaks to the wealthiest. We lowered taxes for 9 million Canadians. We introduced the Canada Child Benefit to reduce inequalities in this country, and that's a track record I'm proud of.
Well, Mr. Speaker, somebody avoided paying the higher taxes that the Finance Minister imposed by selling those 680,000 shares before those measures took place. Someone sold those shares before the new tax measures were tabled in this House of Commons. Now, it was either the minister, and he doesn't think there was anything wrong with that, or it wasn't the minister. And he can just say that. Now, we've repeated everything that was said in the House outside the House. The Liberals have refused to answer questions in the House or outside. Will the Prime Minister answer the question? Who sold those shares in December?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Order. 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 That's enough. I'm sure we'll hear about some things later on. Order. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very happy to hear the question of the Leader of the Opposition, which will allow me to talk about the tax measure that was introduced. What is it? It was to increase taxes for the wealthiest 1% and lower them for 9 million Canadians. The Canada Child Benefit was the most progressive allocation. The previous allowance was taxable. Ours is not. We're giving more to Canadian families that need it most. Thank you.
Manshaw.
Mr. Speaker, the Phoenix shows no signs of rising from the ashes. Problems continue. Now we learn there is no way to assess whether programs to prioritize the hiring of Canada's veterans are working. This government knew about this. They made promises, but still can't claim an increased number of veterans in the public service because they have no way of knowing if or how many veterans have been hired. When will this government show veterans and public servants the respect they've earned and fix the Phoenix problem?
For Veterans Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for her question. There is no question that there are many who have suffered under the Phoenix system, and veterans are certainly one of those. We are doing our level best to identify those who have been affected, and we're asking some of them to come forward It does make it difficult because we do need a head count on these individuals, but I can tell you that these officials are working diligently on the matter, and we ask those veterans who have not come forward and who have been affected by Phoenix, please do so, and we'll do our level best to help. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Mr. Speaker, in committee this morning, the Deputy Minister responsible for resolving the Phoenix fiasco said that IBM did not make a mistake when it created and implemented the pay system. On the contrary, the company just did what it was asked to do. In other words, the entire responsibility lies with the project manager, this government. If the government didn't know what it was doing when implementing Phoenix, how can we expect it to handle this disaster? It's time to work with the real experts, officials, and unions. Honourable Minister of Public Services. Mr. Speaker, please allow me to confirm that the resolution of this situation is my absolute priority. People deserve to be paid correctly and on time. The previous government launched this project and attempted a transformation of complex payroll systems. This project was doomed to failure and included many risks. Currently, we are implementing measures that the previous government did not take.
Rocky Ridge.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the government promised a client-focused CRA, and all we have so far are tax increases on type 1 diabetics, half-baked plans for taxes on retail employees, misinformation, and busy signals. Now there are reports that the CRA are auditing single moms and telling them to get expensive separation agreements, and then telling them, oh, sorry, that's not good enough, and withholding their child benefits. When will this minister stop attacking ordinary, honest Canadians who are just trying to comply and receive the credits and benefits to which they're entitled?
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. I am fully committed to making sure that Canadians get the benefits they are entitled to, especially the most vulnerable people. That is in my mandate letter. It's never the intention of the agency to cause problems for anyone. We are aware that some people cannot always be able to provide all the information in order to review a file. People who are dealing with such a situation should communicate with the agency to get assistance about their situation.
For Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm assisting a single mom with 3 kids who has provided independent third-party letters and even a restraining order to prove to the Canada Revenue Agency that her ex-spouse no longer lives with her. Worse yet, CRA has said that until her ex cooperates with her, she will have her Canada child benefit withheld. Now, this government is being heartless, and I am hearing increasing numbers of cases of similar stories. When will this minister instruct her officials to quit making life more difficult for Canadian single moms?
The Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned, I am fully committed to making sure that Canadians get the benefits they are entitled to, especially those who are most vulnerable. That is at the heart of my mandate letter. I want to reassure my colleague that the agency does not demand that taxpayers obtain a signature from their spouse to obtain the Canada Child Benefit, and I want to repeat that the agency would not ask people in such a situation to communicate with an abusive spouse. Thank you.
I urge the member for Central Okanagan.